So yeah, Mr. and Mrs. Crumbley, they didn't mention the gun, but they did mention that they had been at the shooting range with their son. And this is a community that is so into guns. I can't even believe that these girls, I always look at those pictures on Facebook and think, oh my God, how short are those dresses? And these are girls showing their dresses with their guns in their hand. They know this is a gun community. Reasonable doubt can be found from the fact that the biggest concern at the time was suicide and not homicide. The worst case scenario that was presented would lead a reasonable person to believe there was a possibility of suicide, not homicide. The prosecution seemed to also carry on about the amount of money and time that Mrs. Crumbley spent on horses. Just because she spends money and time on horses doesn't mean she doesn't love her son. And the fact that they have to stretch so much can create reasonable doubt. And if you actually look at the exhibits the defense submitted, you'll see that Mrs. Crumbley said she has to get a second job to pay for the braces, which are very expensive to put on her child's teeth. She paid for her son to be a part of a bowling team. She paid for him to do other sports. She cared about her son. Just because she cared about horses and bought medication from them and had a horse hobby, that's not any different than a dad who likes golf and buys new golf clubs and has a membership to a country club and spends time there and spends money at the bar there on days they go golfing. It's not any different. To try to suggest that it shows the priorities were on horses and not their son is just garbage. This is a son who had everything he needed and all kinds of opportunities in life. A son they take camping and on vacation to Cedar Point. Not only do they take him, they take a friend with them. These are parents that clearly love their child. They're sitting there playing board games with him, spending time doing that. That's all in the Facebook pictures that were admitted. Those are submitted to you as exhibits, and you can take a look at them if you want to. Brian's testimony in this case absolutely creates reasonable doubt. When Brian Meloche testified, there's no question he was inconsistent. And I would submit to you that there was no reason law enforcement needed to interview him for 2 hours, 1 hour, and then 3 hours. But over time, the police certainly caught on to the fact that the more you ask Brian the same question over and over and he realizes he's not giving the answer you like, he changes it. And while the prosecution tries to make it sound like, well, he didn't want his affair outed, from the very beginning, he told them he was having the affair with Mrs. Crumbley. That was not something that ever changed. It wasn't until the third interview when they started talking about his pension, talking about his job, that he felt pressure. He agreed with the word pressure, and he agreed with the word veiled threats, although he did take it back later, that the police wanted him to say something bad about Mrs. Crumbley. And I would submit to you that they probably did that to all of the witnesses in the case. But Brian Meloche was the one who admitted to it. And when Mr. Keast got back up there and asked him more questions, Brian got right back in line like he was supposed to and told them exactly what he knew they wanted to hear. Brian is a terrible witness. He said he had memory problems. And quite frankly, when he's testifying that he knows that the gun was in the car that day of the shooting, we all know no one thinks that's true. Mrs. Crumbley testified and explained the day the gun was in the car. Brian's just wrong. And when Brian testified that Brady was gone and he believed Brady died or committed suicide, I would submit to the jury that Brian is just an idiot and has no clue. And that the truth is, he didn't know the details about where the shooter's friend went. He just knew he went away. Wherever he got that suicide idea from, who knows? The prosecution didn't show any texts or anything to support that. But it's clear that Brian Meloche has been put on a mission, which is, you're coming into court, you've got some things hanging over your head, and we want you to take a position against Mrs. Crumbley. And I would submit to you that if you read the 77-page exhibit that I got yesterday and went through in painstaking detail with you, you can see that Brian Meloche did not think of Mrs. Crumbley that way when he knew her and when he dealt with her. And he testified the only places he got new information about her that made him think differently about his answers were from law enforcement and were from the media. The media that we have talked about in this case repeatedly as being inaccurate. Brian admitted that when the prosecution asked him, and we've already talked about this, to delete his messages, when I went through the part about clear the cache, Jennifer telling him clear the cache, showed him the stuff before and after, he realized it was just to refresh the page to see if Facebook had deactivated. So giving him little bits of information is particularly dangerous because he's not the sharpest. And that's what the prosecution did. They used him to their advantage to try to make it sound like they have this case and all these horrible statements against Mrs. Crumbley. And by the way, when they presented evidence that Mrs. Crumbley is deleting texts and keep making it sound like she selects different texts here and there, it actually sounds like Mrs. Crumbley deletes all her texts, as she testified, that when people start flooding her with text, she deletes entire threads at a time. Who knows what she's deleting? We saw her on her phone flipping through them super fast. And the texts ultimately that she deleted, the prosecution did point out two of them in their closing. They pointed out the texts about "we're fucked" and "we're on the run again," but they didn't mention that she deleted two texts that are actually very exculpatory and helpful to her. Why would she delete some of the most helpful and exculpatory things she said? Those two texts are on page 42 and 44 if you want to see them in the 77-page exhibit. And those two texts confirm, she calls it the string lock was on the gun. She means the cable lock, but she doesn't know enough about guns to say cable lock. The string lock was on the gun. And the other deleted text that the prosecution didn't mention was when she said that the weapon had been locked, the ammunition had been stored separately, and that everything was not loaded. There's no reason she would delete two messages that are that helpful to her. She's just a person who deletes all of her messages, as she testified to. You can find reasonable doubt that Mrs. Crumbley's state of mind is very obvious in statements she made after the shooting. Right away, she's talking about how she had no signs to believe anything would happen. At the substation interview, it's on recording, we watched it. She tells the interviewer, "I had no signs, there were no signs." Then, when they have her in the car, the squad car, and she's in the back, she says to them again, "I had no signs." In her text message with Kira, which was admitted, she says there were no signs. Kira says there probably were, you just missed them. With Brian Meloche, Mrs. Crumbley says again, there were no signs. I would submit to you, this is not some master plan where Mrs. Crumbley decides she's going to suddenly say there's no signs. First of all, there's no evidence of signs Mrs. Crumbley knew about. And second, all of her immediate fast statements in a time of stress, right after she's had guns held to her face, walking out the front door of her house, she's saying there were no signs.